Okay. So what I'm trying to talk about is that there is a great stress on the limited amenities and infrastructure in urban places, leading to congestion and degradation of urban environment. That has a direct bearing on the poor. So conditions, whether it's rural or urban, for the poor, they are similar. But in urban, it becomes much more vulnerable condition. So in other words, what it means is, why don't we find in any city across the globe no place for the poor and marginal communities who come to cities to build the cities? There's nothing in our planning. Our planners don't even think of that. And also, they want their services, but they don't want them. This is the paradox. They feel they're ugly, they're dirty, but at the same time, they require their services in their houses and everything. So this is most of the posh areas are closer to them. You have slums which serve them. In other words, this is the kind of a contrast. Now, do the poor do not have any right in urban center to live in urban centers? Is the question that we need to ask. And now, this is broadly I wanted to bring in the crisis in villages, in agriculture, or in the tribal areas, how it pushed the communities, marginal communities, to urban centers and other places. They became virtually dispossessed people. And when I'm talking about this, now let me come to the kind of thing that I generally would like to always talk about is, there is a pyramid of development, or I would call that as pyramid of sustainable development. If it is possible, I can try and link that. You have at the top of the pyramid the resources. On the left side of the pyramid, you have the knowledge. On the right side, you have the livelihoods. So there is a link between resources and livelihood, and resources and knowledge. Without that knowledge, livelihoods are not possible. And if the resource base is changed, the knowledge becomes waste and useless. So therefore, the resources cannot sustain the livelihoods. There is a kind of thing that I'm talking about. Now, let me first, when I'm talking about the knowledge, it is basically cultural knowledge I'm talking about. In fact, a resource is always is considered as a goods, as a resource that can provide a lot of things for different people. So in other words, in a cultural knowledge, a resource, cultural knowledge becomes a resource, and it is also a guide to action. So cultural knowledge guides people to do things, and it is also important, that kind of a cultural knowledge is important for harmonious living with the nature. So knowledge is therefore related to livelihood, resources, the language, the culture, and their harmonious way of living with the nature. All these are important dimensions anthropologically. So in other words, it is an embodiment of multiple systems of knowledge important for sustainable living. That means it is linked to practices, it is linked to beliefs, it is linked to even social and cultural practices or aspects. So if you want to dismantle such kind of a knowledge, we cannot dismantle it without having any bearing on the communities and environment. In other words, you cannot preserve any knowledge. Knowledge is contextual and linked to the resources and others. It is not a specimen to be preserved in the museum. It's not, even languages cannot be preserved unless they are in practice. So these are all part of the whole system that we are talking about. In fact, in linguistics and nature, when we talk about that. And in other words, it is basically the marginal communities are multicultural and multilingual. And in fact, you will find they speak number of languages. They also live in the midst of multiple communities. We have seen in many of the tribal areas, there are 5 to 6 tribal communities live together. They converse among themselves. They share things. They also resolve the disputes, etc., amongst themselves. And another important aspect of the marginal communities, apart from they being multicultural and multilingual, they also respect the knowledge and culture of the others. And this is very important because they regard others' knowledge as not something less. They learn from that, they also adopt them if required. That means a coexistence of the other communities of users of natural resources is the key for this kind of a sustainable living and sustainable livelihoods. So that coexistence of other communities of users of natural, because they're all natural resource users. So each one uses differently. In fact, we all know what Frederick Barth talked about, ecological niche. Different communities use the same resource differently, so therefore it will not get diminished. So community is basically important for these people, and it's a basic, and individuals are dependent on the community. Therefore, many of them are communitarian, as we're talking about. Now, what is the contrast that we find with the dominant mainstream, so-called mainstream communities is, that is between marginal versus dominant mainstream is, marginal communities by and large, as I said, are communitarian, and resources are always held in common, and community takes care of the needs of its members, that is the members of the households. In contrast, you'll find the dominant paradigm of governance and development of the mainstream is individual centered. That is where we'll find we design all our programs to cater to individuals, not to the communities. That is where many of the programs in the in the tribal and rural areas fail. That means it is basically the development is dominated by the elites and dominant communities or dominant groups. And so that means many of the programs or policies are basically tuned towards the dominant cultures, and that is because they control them. They are the people who design it. So the systems of governance are therefore top-down. The management is top-down. And in spite of a numerical size of the marginal communities, in fact, if you count, they are the largest, more than 40 to 50% they make up. But many of them, their share in the national wealth, if you really look at it, it's almost dismal. Their share in the political power is also quite negligible. So which means a large majority of the people who contribute to the national wealth do not have any kind of a share in the political power, do not have any share in the national wealth, or do not have share in the resources. So another important thing you'll find is many of these community members are in a low paid kind of jobs, low level occupations. Many times we call them as unskilled. They fall in the kind of jobs they're demeaning or defiling, which are not taken up by any of the dominant communities. Now, which means when we are really talking about the way development has taken up the resources of the poor and made them to move out of those areas, created a kind of a crisis in those areas, and also created a crisis for them in their real livelihoods. In fact, they were never dependent on anybody. They were independent, loving, and by and large egalitarian kind of communities. Now they've become dependent. They have no alternative livelihoods. They have no other. In fact, I would always say, as a kind of a fun, that what we have achieved in the independent India is MGNREGA. which made all the communities, all the tribal and other communities from Kanyakumari to Kashmir, or from the Gujarat to Northeast. Of course, Northeast is relatively better. We are not taking that, but the parts of Assam and others, you have all of them are made eligible to become manual labor, and that is where a set of communities, their knowledge and all that becomes useless. So now, when I say development, in fact, what is development? Development usually is considered as a forward movement. It's basically, if it is a forward, that means for a betterment of the humanity. But if you really look at it, it is skewed towards the better off, and both from within and outside, it is skewed. It has most often became a curse for the marginal communities, because now if you say, I will develop you, they will run away from the place. Please don't come and develop anymore, because enough of development, we have lost whatever we have. So many of them have lost the resources, their abodes and livelihoods because of development. In the name of development, natural wealth of the marginal communities are handed over to the rich industrialists, multinationals and others in order to attract FDI or whatever you have. I always call FDI as not the foreign direct investment. Now what we have in the case of COVID or even earlier, it is the foreign what you call direct infection, foreign direct infection. We get that. It is, in a way, we have given the worst things to the poor, taken the best from them. And that means if you look at this, the plight of the marginal communities, they have no other way than to, traditionally they had livelihood diversification. But the livelihood diversification is always related to the seasons and related to the kind of what you call the nature of the resources that they were owning. There are some communities in among the migrant or nomadic groups, especially, they are peripatetic nomads. They don't have resources, but they use their skills and other things in order to earn a living. They depend on, many of these marginal communities, they depend on rural communities to earn the living while they keep entertaining many of them. And they are a different category of the marginal communities. Their conditions are still worse. And when I said marginal communities have to resort to livelihood diversification, it's a coping mechanism for survival. And many of them resort to distress migration now. In fact, including trafficking is one of the serious concerns. Most of the governmental programs or development programs or any other welfare programs or policies have really not benefited the marginal communities much. Now, if you look at the very way forest policy was brought in, it denied the customary rights and access to resources. This I'm talking about including the recent Forest Act, that is what you call making people to have a right to occupation, in the sense that if they are living in that area, they can establish their credentials, they can claim those lands, but it really did not benefit many. So most of the programs are not suitable either, or have not benefited to the communities. Maybe because of the very approach itself, that maybe because they are not communitarian, they are more individualistic. And a tribal cannot live, for example, without the community. Community comes to his rescue. Anything, if somebody is in distress, community helps. Today, that is broken. So the forest policy denied them customary rights and access to resources. Economic reforms have pushed the marginals even further down. When I'm talking about economic reforms, this is basically the economic reforms that have been introduced after 1991. So the tribal communities are increasingly or I would say they are more adversely affected in terms of, first, they lost their, it's almost like a loss of culture, affected by, or they even lost their self-esteem and their dignity and identity. This is what we find in many of the tribal areas today. Tribals today are facing serious crisis of their existence as a community. The tribe as a community, I would say, is on its way out. In fact, I have written in quite some time back in the Eastern Anthropologist, is tribe a fiction? Now you can see how tribe as a concept is no longer usable, because if you use the older definitions, you cannot find tribes today, because they are migrated, they are pushed out, and they are settled in urban places, they're in slums, all these are. So what we notice today is the tribal unity has been bartered in the name of development and globalization. And the, if you look at in the past, in the tribal areas or even the rural areas, there was shortage of food in their annual cycle of the activities or their lives. But you never found starvation deaths during those times. So which means they somehow managed to survive by maybe digging some tubers or some leaves or some other kinds of things they procured from the nature. That means nature provided them the bounty, and the traditional wisdom was always useful in eking out their livelihoods and surviving even in the hardest kinds of times. So today, the traditional wisdom has become irrelevant, and it is not usable because the resources are all gone. You cannot expect a hunter-gatherer to do hunting in Hyderabad. He can't expect any kind of skills that he has is of any use. Or a food gatherer cannot use the knowledge that a food gatherer has. So what has happened is, there is, the traditional wisdom, when it becomes irrelevant and unusable, they have to depend on outsiders' knowledge, and therefore they become completely dependent, and they are under under the mercy of the outsiders. So there is a livelihood crisis now amongst them. Today, therefore, they have become dependent on the government and others in order to eke out their livelihood. That means it's like extending their arms, or their hands for seeking alms. It's like a begging virtually, which is absolutely unfortunate kind of a situation today. And that means earlier the independent kind of people, self-governing people, have become dependent alms-seeking people today. So globalization, economic liberalization, I'm talking about economic, we all know what is called 1991 as the watershed. I don't know whether there is a water in that or a shed in that. It is a tear shed for the poor. Has only accelerated the pace of displacement because all the resources were taken over, productive resources of the poor were taken over in the name of development. In other words, this has deepened the livelihood crisis further. Now, this is the kind of thing development has done. Now, if you really look at the traditional way of management, the resources management, the village commons are a strategy for them to manage the common pool resources. And always the village commons or common pool resources stood in good stead during times of any crisis for the poor. And the marginal communities always managed with the available resources, because they used the resources very prudently, and the community councils always handled the management of the resources. If somebody was doing, say, a shifting cultivation, because shifting cultivation land, once crop is over, it comes back to the community councils, and then they again redistribute among the needy. So the sustainability of the resources and livelihoods are always ensured by the communal management of these resources. So this is where I said uh, earlier, the globalization affected these traditional systems of resource management and the prudent usage of the resources. So once the resources were taken over, they have now become commodities. They have become commodities in the global market to be exploited. I don't need to mention about Niyamgiri, how it has happened. There is only exceptional judgment that is given by Supreme Court. Otherwise, Supreme Court never gave judgments in favor of the marginal communities. You can look at this, and I have umpteen number of cases to cite on this. Now, which means, when their traditional cultural arrangements and knowledge systems are affected, their resources, which they have been using for ages, are no longer there for them. They therefore became very vulnerable. Not because earlier they were vulnerable to the vagaries of nature, but now they have become vulnerable to the vagaries of globalization and forces that globalization has unleashed. And this is also the reason why you'll find the increasing impoverishment and destitution among these communities. So this process very seriously depleted the natural resources. Now you can find, in fact, there's a beautiful article, one of my friend who is from the Ecological Economics Association, he was a president, he was my contemporary. He sent me an article where he showed how these, all these pandemics are a result of degradation of resources, are completely ignoring or neglecting the way resources are being served. And that means the process is, has seriously depleted the resources, leading to many environmental problems, including health and other problems. Today, the polity and governance many a time are compromised to suit the needs of the international collaborators and investors. The resources are up for grab by the multinational players or the rich in the country. I don't want to name the actors in this. Now, given this, many of the agriculturalists and other producers are unable to compete in the market because most of the time the market is controlled by others. So they are prone to committing suicides because they cannot even recover the costs. They cannot even transport their produce. The costs are so because there are so many intermediaries, and the market, vagaries of market destroy them. So in the past, when they were subsistent farmers, they were never dependent on the market, and also the society and the market were dependent on them, as we know how the peasant societies were traditionally. So today market dictates the production and also the prices, and also thanks to globalization, what we call, it's a global village now. And systems of production and distribution have completely moved outside the purview of the producers, which were basically these small and marginal farmers. In such kind of a situation, how can the poor and the marginalized get protection without the support of the government and its agencies? And that is where many of the government's welfare and intervention programs that are introduced, most of them are palliative, and every 5 years, like the magician's wand, they come out and try to show that they are there for the welfare of the poor. I don't know whether they are for welfare or farewell of the poor. Now, in this context, I would like to, having discussed these things, I would like to talk about the triad that I am talking about, or the pyramid that I am talking about. The relationship between the resources and knowledge, between knowledge and livelihoods, and between livelihoods and resources is what I am talking about. All the three, they are not only interrelated and interdependent, but all the three reinforce each other. That means knowledge helps in sustaining the resource. sustenance of the resource helps in continuing the livelihoods. That livelihoods can be carried out because of the knowledge. So that is where, depending on the type of knowledge or the kind of usage, the livelihoods vary. So that means here, sustainability of the three are the very notion of sustainable development. And therefore, sustainable development hinges on these particular kind of triad. And if I am disrupting any of these relationships, it can lead to disruption of sustainable living. It can lead to subordination. It can lead to subjugation of a people by the dominant or invading groups. This is exactly what we today witness. Among the three, resources are the most important, on which the other two are actually dependent. If resources are not there, your knowledge is useless, your livelihoods are not there at all. So therefore, even if the resource is modified, you cannot sustain the livelihood, because resource does not have the same form on which for which the knowledge is not there. Therefore, livelihood is not possible. So which means when resource is more important, if one has to design any kind of program, an understanding of the intricate relationship among the three becomes imminent for any development programs to design, which are eco-friendly, which are people-friendly, and which are livelihood-friendly. So, and understanding of the trio is important for sustainable development. I will try and show that diagram after, because I don't want to waste further time on that. Now, people will always take interest in conserving the resources because it sustains their livelihoods and it sustains them, or their existence is dependent on them. That is why you'll find indigenous and rural poor have a stake in the sustainability of resources. Now, the communities have evolved their customs, beliefs, practices, and normative patterns around these resources. Therefore, we find a kind of a symbiotic relationship between the tribal or rural marginal communities and the resources. On the other hand, the government and the others are interested in the resources, and because they are input for their development. They are not bothered about the knowledge of the poor or the resources of the poor or the livelihoods of the poor. And they say that we will find alternative livelihoods for them, we will find alternative resources for them, nothing will happen. They look at the economic growth and not at sustainable use of resources. Because the indigenous communities look at the sustainable use of resources. So that means rural and tribal marginal communities are interested in the resources, but differently. The governments are interested in the resources because they wanted to take the resources and make enough capital out of it, and without much investments, because that land, they no longer pay any kind of compensation to the poor. So, which means there is a need for a change in the attitude of the mainstream towards the resources and indigenes. I think I should stop it here, and because I don't want to, I'm already, I think, short by 4 or 5 minutes, and I will now give it back to Sunita to conduct the other proceedings.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. It was wonderful listening to you, and very well brought out the perspective to look at the marginalized. So when you look at across the country from east to west or south to north, we can see the picture very clear as to, despite being resource rich, how they are poor. And
Yes.
if I can relate this to Paul Farmer's work, which is also related to public health, and his work in Africa, he also looks at how marginalized communities are structurally uh, uh, introduced in the community, that they face violence every day. So
Yes.
violence not per se as war or conflict, but everyday struggles which they face is more like a violence, and very well put across the same scenario. So it was really interesting to listen to you, and very well see how it was pre liberalization and how they have been totally marginalized even today, and with COVID-19 it becomes very stark. So that was really interesting to listen to you, and I would like to invite all the listeners here to unmute their whoever has questions can unmute and then ask questions directly to Professor Shiv Prasad. There was one question which was asked in the chat box. It was more or less one which you answered little in the later part of your lecture. The question is from Abhishek, asking what must be done to help the marginal communities in contemporary world. I think that's one which everyone would like to know, and if all of us as anthropologists can do our bit, and I'm
Yeah.
sure all the participants here are your students, some or the other batch, they can all interact with you in this forum. I would welcome everyone to interact with Professor Shiv Prasad.
Yeah. I think you'll just answer this
Yes.
last question. What I have been saying is, because there is a change in the approach is what is required from individual to community based. In fact, when we talk about participatory development, all that, these ideas are taken from the people. Our participatory approaches are taken from the people, though we refuse to acknowledge that. And when we say participatory development, many of these developmental programs are not participatory. They're hierarchical. So we need that participatory approach. We need to take into consideration the people's knowledge about the resources in order to rebuild the resources and bring a kind of a balance, eco-balance, which is important for sustainable development. And that is where I'm saying that there is a change in the attitude is what is required of the mainstream towards resources and towards the marginal communities. They are not just a kind of a tools to be used, exploited, and appropriated and condemned. They are the wealth and condemned.
Exactly.
They can't be condemned. They can't be exploited and condemned. And they are the wealth creators. Now, if they are absent for one day in an urban space, your cities will stink and you will all be sick. And if they don't do any work in any factories, the factories are shut down. Now we have to see how post-COVID many of these fellows will handle without the marginal communities. Their participation is essential. In other words, we must not think that we are the masters and others are slaves. And this is what the change in attitude is very important. That's what I'm saying.
Exactly. So there's another question which says that Manju, she is asking, there are marginal communities like the coastal fisher folk who are forced to do overfishing due to the market demand and increased expenditure. How do we see this issue? Do we have an approach to such situations when we look at people depleting their own resources?
I think it's a good question, but the persons who do this deep sea fishing are not the marginal fishermen, the trawlers and other contractors. In fact, George Kurian has worked enormously on this area. And in other words, if fishermen are also marginal communities. They use, in fact, as Raymond Firth says, they are also a kind of a peasant, except that they, instead of land, they are depending on the sea or rivers. So they don't do, it's not the market demand that drives them. You see, the small fish that they catch, if the supply is less, demand is more, they get more price. So the supply demand kind of a thing, if you really work out, it works against the marginal communities. So this is exactly the same what I'm talking about the tribal or any land-based communities. Same is the case with the water-based or livestock-based, all that.
So when you said about participatory method,
Yeah.
often it's seen that even with the development agencies, they get to talk to people, but it's much more token in terms of participation. It's always more or less it's always top down, and they don't really understand the cultural fabric of the communities.
Yes.
And my own work in disasters, I've seen how entire top-down approach completely shatters the local fabric and even dismantles their family, which are very community living. And as you said, individual, and when you look at individual and there is more communitarian living, it completely destroys. I mean, the whole planning, policy, interventions are all very individualistic, which actually changes their entire scenario.
In fact, methodologically, there is a work by Lawrence Salmon. Lawrence Salmon, Listening to the People. It's a small booklet published by Oxford University. We used it. He was in the World Bank. He's an economist. But what he did was, he was critical of Robert Chambers and others. Because Robert Chambers says that it is a development tourism. And Lawrence Salmon says Robert Chambers is also development tourism, because 1 week, 10 days is not a kind of a thing that you can talk about participatory development. However much somebody is this thing. He says observer evaluation method for a longer period of time. You stay there in a developmental area for 2-3 months, and then you can really get the inputs and then make the development more participatory. So it is again methodologically there are a lot of issues, and the attitude, that is basically that attitude of the developmental planners.
A few more questions. One is, what about epistemological positioning in understanding indigenous community? Can we deconstruct this colonial construct with indigenous worldview? I'm not able to get the name. Yes,
yeah, but it is basically what I have done is that I did not go back to colonial structures, but post-colonial, they are the same. We are still colonial, except that there is a change in color of the rulers, only skin color. But in terms of other textures, they're all same. In terms of administration, in terms of the norms, practices, outlook, everything is same. So epistemologically, there is, who is going to listen to the marginal perspective? It's like, worm's eye view and bird's eye view. And somebody says, early bird catches the worm. I always say, poor worm unnecessarily got up early. Otherwise, it dies. So this is exactly what it is, because your entire, you see, before British, it was communitarian. Nobody bothered about that. Nobody took over the resources. After the British, the resources became potential for exploitation. So the post-colonial is what we are now using it. All our development programs are Western module oriented, and we don't even think that they are a failure there, but still they say that don't do it, but we still do it. This is a paradox.
There's another very interesting comment, and also a question from Abhishek Bardhan. He says, in this very time of COVID, the changes are a grim reminder of how we, the modern humans, have taken over the earth. We have encroached on the territory of other living beings and the very first indigenous people. We have destroyed habitats, killed animals, overused resources. We do not own this planet. We share the world with a lot of other living beings. Our life is as much about cohabitation as about survival of the fittest. We humans cannot be bringing down forests, destroying habitats, and polluting oceans, putting the survival of others at stake. Please throw some light on this.
Yeah, I think I said this in the very beginning. How the marginal communities believe nature belongs to every creature. every creation of the nature and not an exclusive right of the humans. The arrogance of humans today is that I can control nature. I can dictate the way nature can be molded. So you can dictate nature to some extent, not beyond that. If there is a fury of flood, which kind of knowledge or science can stop it? Or earthquakes, you cannot do anything else. That means nature has its own set limitations. You cannot go beyond that. We have destroyed nature. Now you can see Amazon islands. The Amazons are like storehouse of oxygen. They are getting destroyed. And what happens with this is number of species living on them are going down. And many other, in fact, I think it was Bhaskar who posted one thing in the group, the Cobra effect. It is that kind of a thing because we are looking for short-term gains, not looking at the long-term perspective. Now, COVID might not teach us much lessons. It will be short-term lessons. In the long term, we are not going to learn. We commit the same mistakes. We don't learn out of the mistakes, and we don't try to become more sensible. If we have to be sensible, what he's saying is what I have been saying. We need to care for the resources. We should not think we are the masters. We are slaves of nature, not masters of nature. Nature gives us something, we must accept that and live comfortably with that. It has, that's what, as Gandhi said, nature has everything for everybody's need, not for everybody's greed.
Yes, sir. There's actually one person stating that it was an excellent presentation. In fact, many of them have said that. But one of our listener, Anindita, she wrote that your presentation has really helped her theoretically, and that her work in Kasi in Meghalaya, she'll be applying that for her work on management of natural resources and cultural resources. And there's another question. After all that has been done, good or bad, via British era, contacts with mainstream plus constitutional efforts, do you think we can restore marginalized groups back into original condition, especially the tribals? If not, what's the alternative?
See, it's a big question.
True.
If we want to restore, the resources are all taken over. And the persons who have taken over the resources are not going to give it back. And we are not so generous. If we were so generous, we wouldn't have taken over the resources. After all this, we wouldn't have even thought of continuing with that. We could have said, come on, you go ahead with your resources, live back and bring back the resources to their glory so that it helps all humanity. It's just not possible. What is alternative? The alternative is at least allowing them to have some rights in resources, allowing them to have some kind of a right over what they want to do, what they wish to do, how to govern themselves, how to govern the resources. That is what, when we talk about PESA Act envisages that, but PESA Act is totally diluted. It is never implemented. Even if it is implemented, it is implemented in such a way it is virtually useless. I don't see much because people say that, in fact, I'm in another group where in agriculture and other sectors, where they say that if we can now revive rural agriculture, organic agriculture and other things, and use the same labor, reorient them. If that is possible, that will be the greatest thing that is to happen. Because agriculture is neglected, and that can feed large number of people, that can also sustain large number of people. Allied activities of agriculture can be taken up. I don't think with the kind of models that these governments have, like the kind of models of monetization, demonetization, you cannot expect anything from these governments.
So there's another question, interesting question about how we look at it as an anthropologist and how economists look. The question is, how do we address the understanding of academic level, especially speaking from the perspective in discipline where environmental issues are seen as externalities and
Yes.
incentives as method is adopted to address the issue. How anthropologists should and fill this void of perspective with other discipline. Question from Samiksha. So,
Yeah, you see, very interesting thing that we find today is economists, especially those who are teaching environmental economics or ecological economics, they largely resort to anthropological studies. But for them, uh, a resource is an input. A resource is a capital, is a goods to earn money. That means how much I can uh, earn out of a resource, and what is the kind of a gap between if its resource is being depleted, if I wanted to restore it, if the restoration costs are less, and I can exploit the resource. So they talk in terms of that kind of equation. They're economic equations, classical economics, as we talk in peasant societies, China and others talk about it. Classical economics cannot explain, because the concept of profit doesn't exist among the marginal communities with regard to the resources. If they were to be interested in profits, they could have become the richest fellows in the world. So economists, there are some economists who are working, but there are economists like an anthropologist who don't bother about all this. They say that how can you say without development how it is possible? There are anthropologists who argue for development, who argue that tribals can't manage themselves, we have to manage them. That is the unfortunate state.
so, so another question which says relevance of environmental determinism and possibilism in the outbreak of COVID-19. If you can throw some light on this. And he was also thinking of survival of fittest. I mean, that's not to be applied, but
yeah.
How do we see that?
It is this. See, some of these theories that were proposed were based on, in fact, determinism was negated. The possibilism was an alternative that has come. Because what are the possibilities that are available? Based on that, we talk about the resources and these things. But I would say that, we should look at our own approaches to looking at the resources should be motivated by the outlook of the people. If we can try and theorize the way the natives theorize, I think that would be the best kind of a theorization for anthropology, because we are tending to generalize by some kind of a perspective, but at the same time we ignore the local variations. In fact, this is where again Frederick Barth's what we call the kind of models that he talks about, generative models and other things. I'm not saying exactly that, but what we need to look at is, if we are making a study, let us first understand what the people look at it, how that can be theorized. In fact, this is where I would say a strong, good ethnographic studies are essential to build theories. Because most of the, as Dan Sperber says, most of the anthropologists are only ethnographers, not anthropologists. In fact, he makes that comment because we don't use ethnographies, because ethnographies are data for us. We should use the data to theorize. Anthropology is about theory building, not only ending with ethnography. Ethnographer doesn't have to care for how it was done, but we have to care for that, because how everything becomes an evidence for your arguments or logic. So that is what we need to look at. That means a good ethnographic kind of a thing should be used. I would say that you develop your own theories. Don't think that earlier theories are only the alternatives available to us. And if we do that, then we are seeing the end of the discipline. I wouldn't advise that.
So I think they're also interested to look at your diagram, which it's a pyramid. But yeah, interestingly, there's been few more questions. I don't think we can take each and every question, but a very important question which is coming up is how can we be anthropocentric in approach and not incorporate into policy making? So I think if we can look into how anthropological knowledge can be brought into the policy and not anthropology is not just culture centric. It has
right.
perspectives of political economy. It questions power, but are we being very idealistic? Are we being looking at very utopian model? How do we make anthropological knowledge to apply in policy and bring in change? I think that can be said, and most of our questions will be sorted out.
In fact, in fact, when I am talking about the whole thing, I was talking keeping in mind the policy aspects, keeping in mind the programs. And in fact, I remember my teacher, Professor Srinivas, used to tell how anthropologists were not taken into consideration by policymakers. And he used to write critically continuously. And later they said how micro level data is important. He said, for example, if there is a cattle market, if one studies cattle market, how cattle markets operate, what kind of policies, cattle policies can be devised based on that. So these were the kinds of things we talked about. In fact, the best book that has come out, the dialogue between anthropologists and economists, is by Pranab Bardhan, as a sequel to Srinivas's things. And I'm saying it's not that, unlike earlier, now at least the planning commission, or now what we call the Niti Aayog, is concerned about this thing, and they include anthropologists. But how far the anthropologists are heard and how far anthropologists forcefully put forth their view is something that we need to ponder over. And in fact, if you look at in the World Bank, or if you look at in many major programs, the planning level is done by the anthropologists. Michael Chernia, or in fact, I can name, if you type anthropologists in the World Bank, you get list of names. I had interacted with some of them in Hyderabad when they came for SERP, when they were establishing another group. 4 of them are anthropologists from the World Bank. And they said, when I was arguing, they said, I'm very glad that there is an anthropologist. And Professor Mahendra Dev said, you don't want others to be there. I said, we want not the people who are concerned about numbers. We want those people who are concerned about humanity and human beings. If the economists, there are plenty of economists who are concerned about the humanity and human beings, we welcome them. Not those who only talk about statistics, who only talk about econometric models. Then he said, oh no, he smiled it and said, no, I understand. Why I'm saying this is, there are, it's not that they are not there. But how effective we are as a group, and this is where you need more number of people coming out to publish. We hardly have people writing. In West, they do it. I think many of our youngsters should put it on the web if they have ideas, and they can own it. And that is where nobody will ask us, invite us, be in the policy body. You have to push yourself into that body by virtually your continuous writing.
That's exactly the point, sir. Now with social media, each of us can just write and go public. So anybody who is interested will definitely look into your ideas and points and get back. And in fact, there are few questions, but I think there are some related to COVID-19 and migrant workers. We may need another lecture on that. And especially coming up with the labor laws which are changing, I think that's a serious issue which also needs to be debated, and how that would impact on the people's, especially the laborers' lives. I think that's very important. And so if you can share the pyramid, maybe they would be happy to understand it better.
I hope I will be able to do it. Yeah. Or I will do one thing.
sir.
I have on my desktop. I'll open this in desktop
Sure.
and show it there.
You can do that. And meanwhile, I would just like to announce about the Anthropos India Foundation's ethnography course, which is coming up. And I have shared the link. Whoever is interested can join this course. It's 3 days course. So do you want this share screen, or you want to put the other screen in front?
I'm putting the other screen.
Okay.
Because share screen, I'm a bit getting
No
this.
problem. No
It
problem.
doesn't take much time. I'll just do it.